evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, and this is Englebrook Independent News Federal Crime Report. Tonight, we take you across the southern and eastern United States into federal courtrooms where prosecutors are pursuing cases involving political corruption, violent crimes, drug trafficking, fraud schemes, and crimes against children. From Maryland to Florida and across the Deep South, these are cases shaping the federal justice landscape as we close out March of 2026. We begin in Maryland, where federal prosecutors say have unsealed a sweeping indictment against political campaign treasurer accused of embezzling campaign funds for personal gain. 58-year-old James Appeal of Annapolis is charged with wire fraud and money laundering, accused of stealing approximately $200,000 from both state delegation campaigns and community organizations. According to federal investigation, Appeal allegedly transferred campaign funds into accounts he controlled, then moved the money into personal accounts. Prosecutors say he used those funds to bolster financial statements while refinancing a luxury yacht. Authorities allege he submitted fraudulent campaign financing report and misrepresented assets to both banks and state officials, extending the scheme into 2026. If convicted, Appeal faces a significant federal prison time. Officials emphasize this is an indictment and he is presumed innocent until proven guilty. In a separate Maryland case, a repeat offender is heading to prison for more than a decade. 37-year-old Anthony McNair has been sentenced to 140 months in federal prison for drug trafficking and illegally free firearm possession. During a traffic stop, officers recovered fentanyl, crack cocaine, and a loaded handgun. Prosecutors say McNair, already a convicted felon, attempted to flee before being detained. He will serve his sentence consecutively to a prior 210-month sentence in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, federal agents have charged a foreign national in a complex romance fraud scheme. Alil Hubu Mamin, a Nigerian national living in Maryland, is accused of orchestrating a multi-layered fraud operation targeting victims through a fake romance relationship. Prosecutors say Mamin created a shell company, opened 13 bank accounts, and funneled money across international borders, including China, India, and Indonesia. If convicted, he faces up to 20 years in prison per count. In West Virginia, federal prosecutors continue their aggressive push against drug trafficking and immigration-related fraud. Jeffrey Allen Jones of Ohio has pled guilty to trafficking fentanyl and crack cocaine with possession of a firearm. Authorities seized significant quantities of narcotics and a loaded weapon during a search of his residence and motel room. He faces decades in prison when he is sentenced in July. In a separate case tied to a large-scale immigration enforcement operation, a Mexican national living here illegally in West Virginia pled guilty to using counterfeit immigration documents to obtain employment. The investigation, part of the Operation Country Road, resulted in more than 650 arrests statewide. Restaurant owners and additional defendants now face federal charges for allegedly harboring undocumented workers and facilitating document fraud. And in Huntington, multiple drug cases are moving through federal court. Tavon Morrison pled guilty to distributing crack cocaine, while Sherry Woodson has been sentenced to 10 years in prison after authorities seized methamphetamine, fentanyl, and firearms from his residence. In Virginia, federal prosecutors are handling one of the most disturbing cases of the month. A former firefighter has pled guilty to producing child sexual abuse material involving an infant. Authorities say Alex Burgana recorded and distributed abuse videos more than 90 times and invited other participants. He now faces a minimum of 15 years in federal prison. In another Virginia case, a former congressional staffer has pled guilty to wire fraud after stealing more than $22,000 from a sitting member of Congress. Courtney Haraska used retained banking information after leaving her position to pay off personal credit card debt. She faces up to 20 years in prison. In Tennessee, repeat drug offense continue to drive lengthy prison sentencing. Jonathan Forrest has been sentenced to 20 years in prison after authorities seized large quantities of methamphetamine, marijuana, and other drugs. Meanwhile, a major healthcare fraud settlement, American Health Partners has agreed to pay over $2 million to resolve allegations of substandard care at Tennessee nursing facilities. Federal officials say the facility failed to provide adequate medical treatment, infection control, and patient safety protection, impacting vulnerable elderly residents. In North Carolina, a fugitive accused of child exploitation has been extradited to the United States after nearly a decade on the run. Roberto Haraza now faces multiple federal charges involving child sexual abuse material. In another case, a convicted sex offender has been arrested for illegally voting in federal elections while on supervised release. And a Nigerian national has been sentenced to 15 years in prison for orchestrating a romance fraud scheme that defrauded victims of more than $1.5 million. In South Carolina, 5 individuals are now facing federal charges in a $3.5 million sweepstakes fraud scheme targeting elderly victims. Prosecutors say victims were tricked into paying fees to claim non-existent prizes, funds that were then laundered internationally. In Mississippi, a man has pled guilty to a violent shooting on a tribal land and faces decades in prison. Meanwhile, federal agents have arrested 8 individuals tied to drug distribution networks uncovering through the Homeland Security Task Force investigation. In Alabama, a woman has been indicted for distributing methamphetamine and fentanyl, and a convicted felon has been sentenced to more than 14 years in prison after a shooting incident involving an illegal firearm possession. In Georgia, an armed repeat offender has been sentenced to more than 7 years in federal prison after leading police on a high-speed chase. And in a massive drug trafficking conspiracy, dozens of defendants have now been convicted in a sprawling operation running partially from inside a state prison using contraband cell phones. Some face life sentences. In Florida, a Pennsauken man has been sentenced to 30 years in prison after attempting to kill a sheriff deputy during a pursuit. Additional cases include charges for attempted child enticement, illegal firearm possession involving machine gun conversion devices, and a $1.2 million fraud targeting elderly hurricane victims. And in a major corruption case, employees and inmates at a detention facility have been charged in a bribery and contraband smuggling scheme involving drugs and cell phones. From political corruption to violent crimes and to complex international fraud, federal prosecutors across the Southeast are continuing to pursue cases that impact communities at every level. As always, those charged are presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, and this has been your Englebrook Independent News Federal Crime Report. Stay informed, stay safe. Good night.